Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. And we're very fortunate that we have a moderator today from Higher Immigrants Ottawa. So Kelly, I'm going to hand this over to you to welcome everyone and begin the webinar.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you today. Just a few notes before we start. One is that as we go through the presentations, if you've got questions, and we hope you have questions, please feel free to pop those into the chat. We will address all of the questions after the three presenters have presented, and look forward to some conversation and dialogue with you after those presentations. As per usual, we ask you to mute your microphone, turn off your phones for the presentation today. A couple of things that I wanted to touch on before we launch into our first presenter. One is that I wanted to acknowledge that the news in recent days, of course, from British Columbia, from London, Ontario, from other areas has been devastating. And just that this is a reminder that the work of both reconciliation and inclusion and equity are vital to our communities now and for our future. And leading from that, I want to acknowledge before we go into our event that the land from where I am presenting to you right now is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. And I invite you to take the time to understand the history of the land wherever you live, wherever you conduct your work and your business. For those of us who emigrated to this land by choice, by force, by displacement, or were born here in subsequent generations, we recognize that as settlers and as immigrants, we are bound to the treaties of this land. And so that takes me now to our first presenter. And our first presenter today is Professor Francine Schlosser, here from the University of Windsor, where currently she holds the Odette Professorship in Entrepreneurship and Innovation. And Francine will present Resilience Twice Made and Once Tested, Immigrant Entrepreneurs' Adaptation to the COVID-19 Pandemic. And Francine.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Kelly. So today I'm going to be presenting on, I'm just going to move this a little bit. Okay, I'm going to actually be presenting something a little bit different than what I had planned to present. And for researchers out there, I'm sure you know how difficult it is to collect data sometimes. And during the pandemic, it was even more difficult. So what's actually happened is I don't have much of a comparison here, but I am focusing quite a lot on immigrants. I've combined a couple of data sets that we were fortunate enough to collect over time, and I'm giving you what I can on this topic. Let's put it that way. It's not what I wanted to give you, but I'm giving you what I can. So I've been very fortunate to partner with Kyle Brickman, who's also on this call, and Jerry Kerr, who are both professors at the University of Windsor. And Kyle's study, it was a quantitative study, which I'll be talking about as study one, was funded by WeSpark, which is an initiative to fund COVID-19 related research. And Jerry Kerr, he has been funded through the BMRC for a paper, well, for a research on older immigrants. And so I'll also be talking about that one as well. And I partnered with both of them on both of those projects. Okay, there it is. Okay, so our research questions when we started out our different projects were basically how do immigrant SME, small, medium, and small and medium-sized enterprises, how do the owners of these small businesses build resilience necessary for survival under extreme pressure, especially during a COVID-19 pandemic? How do immigrant SME owners compare to native-born SME owners? And how does the mixed embeddedness concept explain the development of multiple levels of resilience in immigrant SME owners? So immigrants are extremely important in the world of business. So even just regular small and medium-sized enterprises make up 98% of the businesses in Canada. And they employ 2/3 of, they're actually responsible for 2/3 of the employment growth in Canada as well. So they're extremely important. And within SMEs, when we start looking at immigrant-owned SMEs, they actually are extremely entrepreneurial. So immigrants initiate more than 25% of US companies. I'm giving you US and Canadian data here. They're twice as likely to become entrepreneurs as native-born citizens. They're 1.3 times more likely to launch high-growth firms, providing most employment expansion in developed economies. They have higher survival rates, and they're very important trade intermediaries and with many transnational connections. So they often start businesses in 2 countries simultaneously, which also helps them grow. They are more likely to implement product, process, and marketing innovations. So very, very important in business. And many of them even come here and they're not under the category of business people. They come here because they're family, they're refugees, they might even be knowledge workers, and they still show entrepreneurial tendencies. And you'll see that in our study too. So the impact of COVID-19 has been pretty drastic on immigrant-owned SMEs. It's generally worldwide has had a more severe economic impact on immigrant business owners than on native business owners. Almost twice the rate of drop in US business ownership in the first 2 months of the pandemic. And the majority of the businesses in higher risk industries are owned by immigrants. So, well, I shouldn't say the majority, but a very significant, healthy amount. Immigrants own 33% of businesses in the accommodation and food services. And we know what's happened to tourism, hotels, restaurants during this COVID pandemic. It's been very difficult for them. However, they also own a respectable share of essential businesses, you know, your corner stores and your grocery stores and that type of thing. And as the epidemic wore on, they were actually able to recover in some ways due to their presence in these essential businesses. So mixed embeddedness is a concept that's, I think it's spread through sociology as well as, the political area and now into entrepreneurship and business. And Kloosterman noted that it's really the interaction of social relations, economic transactions, and the surrounding political economic structures. So how embedded you are in that can affect certainly your resilience. So looking at it through these multiple levels will help us to better understand resilience. So we look at the macro level, which looks at the phenomena and the institutions, the meso level, which looks at more of the local opportunity, the business opportunity, and the micro level, which is at that level of the individual entrepreneur. So macro level embeddedness really looks at the structural constraints and supports that can affect entrepreneurial resilience of immigrant businesses. They had pre-pandemic challenges, that were related to, access to capital and language issues, cultural translation issues. But these were exacerbated basically by government responses to COVID-19. They had difficulty accessing the financing supports from COVID-19. And so therefore they had problems accumulating enough resources to survive. There were less support provided to immigrant businesses in some countries. Immigrants also didn't just generally trust institutional sources of information about the pandemic because they come from places sometimes that you don't trust the institutions. So that created a lot of communication issues that negatively affected immigrants. At the meso level, embeddedness level, we look at opportunity resilience, the business opportunity, and the nature of the opportunity, whether you're self-employed versus employing other people. Those businesses differ in their ability to survive and the resilience. And there's a much more of a movement in and out of self-employment than there is in and out of like a larger business that employs other people. So you can probably figure out why. It's a little bit easier if you're self-employed. If you find a better job working for someone else, then you will go to that job, right? The ownership arrangement will affect, the access to needed resources, and the team can really impact how the organization grows at the management level, and so that's also a part of embeddedness at the opportunity level. So there's some overlap also when you look at the consideration of the entrepreneurial opportunity level and the psychological resilience of the entrepreneur, because many people who start their businesses are their babies, right? So there is this connection between the two. And here you can see the self-employed opportunity, of course, is very much completely the same as the psychological resilience of the entrepreneur. Whereas the larger ones would depend more on the team itself, but it's still very embedded. So at the micro level, we look at this individual level of the entrepreneur and their own psychological resilience. And so generally at the micro level, we look at, or at the individual level, we look at personal attributes and competencies that are developed through personal experiences that allow individuals to navigate difficult events. And that's a fairly frequent resilience definition, but that's really depending on the trait perspective. Sorry, I forgot to turn off my clock, but it's almost done. Anyway, it is really building on the trait perspective. So we look at these psychological and dispositional factors like competence or societal support systems and personality traits. And so, you look at the characteristics of migrant entrepreneurs. Some researchers have recently found that they actually helped them weather the COVID-19 pandemic because they had just an innate resilience, this twice made resilience, in fact, where they come from another country, having to be resilient there to overcome many obstacles in a number of cases to then move here and start over. So they do have this innate characteristic that can help them. From a process perspective, we look more at the mechanisms through which the internal and external assets are engaged when people are faced with adversity. So for instance, can they engage networks that can offer them support, emotional support or instrumental support like financial or person support, including business-related resources during COVID-19. So those are the things that will help as well in terms of developing that psychological resilience. So it's a little bit of a messy concept, I think. There are arguments for antecedents and outcomes of resilience all being gathered together in this nice big silo of resilience. So there certainly is probably a need to further examine and distinguish resilience from antecedents and outcomes. So in our sample, we were looking at this then through two different lenses. The first data set we had was actually supposed to be a longitudinal data set collected at two different times with the SME owners and the employees and matched. However, we had a lot of trouble getting responses on this. And, sometimes the businesses went out of business or they were closed, so their employees were laid off, or they were just really busy and ramping up. And so they had no time to do this. So what we've settled on is we're just using the Time One data set for the 77 small business owners. And these are backbone businesses, right? And that we're talking about in both the first and the second data set. These are businesses like restaurants, retail, services, personal services, things that make our lives move forward. These aren't the really fancy, innovative, high growth ones. These are just your regular businesses that make our society work. So of the first data set, there were 14 immigrants that emigrated from 13 different countries. And 2/3 of the native born SMEs and 1/2 of the immigrant SMEs were considered essential services. So very healthy amount on both ends. That's probably why they answered it, because they were still in operation, right? So the SMEs categorized as essential during the pandemic were larger and non-essential SMEs were more likely to be family owned. The second data set is comprised of 20 interviews with recently migrated owners of mainly nascent SMEs at 2 times, before and during COVID. So at the macro level, we're looking at, some of the political and structural issues, institutional issues that affect these businesses and the people running them, and especially the firm resilience, though. And there was a real positive impact of political decisions with respect to essential frontline services, because in both studies, they both continued to operate. And in fact, they actually became very healthy, in terms of where they were going. But there is a huge negative impact of political decisions. 45% in the study 2 sample had either closed or delayed opening their businesses due to the pandemic. So, that became a real issue that was just
2 minutes, Francine.
difficult to surmount. 2 more minutes? Okay. There were just insufficient resources to overcome operational challenges, and they had a lot of concerns about how they could even retain their employees. They drained their savings to meet the additional regulatory restrictions and requirements for safety supplies. And that was study 2. That also came up in study 1 across both native born and immigrant businesses. Oops, sorry. So at the MESO level, that's at the opportunity level, the business opportunity level. And we're looking at, again, resilience of the business opportunity itself. There were 2 themes that came up, and these had to do with communication, employee communication and customer communication. So most SMEs develop formalized strategic and operational communication. And they really focused on developing team cohesion, like game nights, that type of thing, very informal. But the immigrant owners were more focused on task and much more directive with the employees. Their quotes on the open-ended questions were much more directive. And they definitely had different employer expectations of the employees' motivations, initiative, and resilience. And I think that the immigrants weren't sure how much they could trust their employees to get something done. So they felt more directive. They had lower expectations of them. Whereas some of the other SMEs, they would be saying things like, well, we sent the employees home and they developed their own work plan. Whereas an immigrant might say, I developed it for them. And the customer communication was a real problem because there was a real lack of connection with customers. Customers didn't even know when the businesses were open, and a real preference for return to face-to-face operations. And this appeared to be more of an issue with the immigrants, possibly because they just weren't embedded enough in the community. And then at the micro level, we looked at the owner. And, the owner was important. Making sure I'm okay mentally was a direct quote as a key employee support strategy. So making sure that, the owner was feeling healthy himself, then was able to provide more support to their employees. So that was an important part of it. Study 2, the immigrants had overcome so many personal challenges. Many of them were from Syria and Iraq. And there was stress related to trying to plan or open the Canadian business during the pandemic. And it really created illness in some and directed them to pursue other employment paths. And this is my last slide, Kelly. So, and the implications then of these studies is we tried to synthesize the 2 of them and use the embeddedness framework in which, multi-level relationships reinforce a macro level and the importance of government support. And many of the study 2 participants were self-employed nascent businesses that were suspended, potentially because they didn't meet structural requirements to access government aid. So there were still some real challenges at the meso and micro level that government policy could not help. The pandemic focused management practices on basic communication with customers and employees, and the resilience, the entrepreneurial resilience was important at both the organization and the individual level of the SME owner. So that concludes our preliminary findings on these. We're going to have a chapter in the book that will look pretty much like this, but there will be quite a larger, I guess, a review of study 2 in particular, for because there's a huge amount of information and study too that I haven't touched on. Thank you.